This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends Library. The date is November 15th, 1969. The location is the National Cowboy Hall of Fame and Western Heritage Center. Our interview today is with Mr. Fred Harmon, who is today a Western artist and a cowboy, but who formerly was the drawer and creator of the well-known Western cartoon comic strip Red Ryder. Mr. Harmon, I wonder if you could tell us something about your parentage and early life.
My early life, as you can look at my face, dates back to 1902 when I was born in St. Joseph, Missouri. My dad was a countryman and also a young attorney, and married my mother, who was from Ohio. I was born in 1902, but when I was 2 months old, my dad and mother went back to my ranch, which he had previously homesteaded in southwestern Colorado out of Pagosa Springs, Archuleta County, in about 1900, and that was very primitive during that time. In fact, the last Indian battle was not far from us. The Paiutes there, I think history records that was 1916. I was about 14 at that time. So my beginning then was on ranches and working as a kid, milking cows and any chores that a kid would do. And I was taken back to St. Joe, Missouri for a few months for my first year of schooling, and then we returned back to Colorado again. And then I went to work on various other ranches, and then during the wintertime I would go back to Kansas City to get out of the heavy snows, and I worked in the Kansas City Star down in the press rooms, and then returned in the spring to the ranch again. While my parents at that time stayed in Kansas City. About that time, the World War I came along. I wanted to go whip the Kaiser like everybody else did, the grown-up boys. I was only 15, but I got into the Home Guard underage at 15, and then they later swore me into the regular Army. I'd been in that a year in Truman's regiment. Well, he went on to France, and they gave me a furlough. I went back to punching cows, and I still stayed there because I was underage. And I kept that up till I always wanted to get into art work. So I went back to Kansas City from the ranch, and my first job was with the Kansas City Film Ad Company. That's where I met Walt Disney. He was one of the young cartoonists, and I was too. So we quit and went into business and went broke in about a year, and I went back to punching cows. He went to Colorado, and as you know, he did California, raised a lot of money, and he did pretty good for himself. And when I went back to the ranch again and started working on ranches, and a friend of mine from Kansas City wired me that I could get a job in an engraving house in St. Joseph, Missouri, as a commercial artist. So I rode about 10 miles with a gunny sack and an old cowboy friend of mine to catch a free ride in an automobile to Denver, and I arrived in St. Joe with a gunny sack on my back and 3 months of not shaving, and there's where I met my wife, who was a musician and happened to be on the first floor of this building, and I was on the 5th floor, and that's how we got acquainted. And we were married shortly, and that's when my son, who's sitting here now, was born in 1927, the day Lindbergh arrived in Paris. Well, I still wanted to get back into cowboy work, so I went back to the ranch. He was quite young then, and swung an axe and built a log cabin until September came, and he was about 7 then, and I had to get him in school, so I went to Hollywood. That seemed to be the closest place to get him in school. Sold my automobile and sent the money to my wife to come to get out there. So I about starved to death trying to get a cartoon strip started, and I finally made it. And the first one was called Bronc Peter, which very few people know, and it wasn't successful. I had Little Beaver in it. I went to New York to do some books on request of a publisher. I'm dating ahead now to 1938. I changed the name of the comic strip I had to Red Ryder, and the syndicate bought it immediately, and from then on it was an instant success. And for some unknown reason, the same comic, the same author, same artist, but change of name. And almost overnight I had top circulation of approximately 750 American daily and Sunday newspapers. So from then on, you're more or less forced into it. You start living the life of Red Ryder at public request. It started first by newspapers, public appearances. Meanwhile, my wife and I had bought a new ranch and started building that up. That was 1941. So until 1941, or that period, I drew Red Ryder until 1962, when I discontinued it, took it off the market to do what I'm doing now on large Western oil paintings. But during that period, the government would hop on you for different things, like the Second World War. Different people with names, actors, artists, and so forth, would devote their time to selling bonds and raising money for the Treasury Department. And then, being known as Red Ryder, I would travel abroad entertaining troops, Europe, Far East, and all types of things like that that come into it. I wish you'd ask me a question here. I can think of so many things, but
All right.
you can prompt me.
I'd like to know about Red Ryder. Was he, why did you choose Red Ryder? Was he autobiographical?
They say that, and I suppose it was, but I didn't try to make it look like me. They say it did, but that had nothing to do with it. I never thought of that. But growing up, 1902 seems like a long ways to some people, but when you remember, they did have covered wagons then. I do not try to imitate or draw what Charlie Russell did back in the 80s and 90s, and I do not try to attempt to paint what Remington painted. Mine are I go back once in a while on request, but most of my artwork, which you see here now at the Cowboy Hall of Fame, is my life or my friend's life, or what I saw around me, like the Navajos and the Apaches, of whom I grew up with. I don't mean in their hogans or teepees, but they were my friends, and they were all around me, and still are to this day. But having lived the life as a cowboy, I draw that type of painting. But I not only draw bucking horses, but I take in the entire West, and take in the Indian and our Mexicans and those who live there right at the present time. But it's all cow and cattle country. But I'm known as a cowboy artist, not a Western artist. A Western artist, in my terms, is one who goes out there and paints what he sees. Cowboy artist is like Will James. He paints what he has done or what his neighbors have done and things like that.
Sometimes you see, I've had the impressions often from comic strips that they are quite influential in public opinion.
Oh my goodness, you have a tremendous advantage there, because I think they considered Red Ryder approximately 40 million daily readers, and that's a terrific audience. And I think the movies, I think that was a 8,000 theater audience. And for 10 years I had 3 half-hour weekly radio shows, just like the Lone Ranger type and things of that type. So therefore you have a terrific impact. In other words, let's say Red Ryder couldn't smoke in a rodeo. I might be dying for one. I'd have to hide back of a horse or something. But you're an influence to the younger juveniles. In other words, you're perfect, infallible. I'd be out in the arena and one of the greatest world champion cowboys would be bucked off, and here the whole crowd would yell, "Red Ryder, get on there and show him," see? But he's invincible, a comic hero.
I've also observed that probably the comic strips, more than any other specific medium, has in recent years. I know these particular things were not your problems at the time, but they have taken after the drugs and have taken after the
Oh, yes.
hippies and this group more than any other specific medium.
Well, it's because you have such a terrific audience. My goodness, for years you could make yourself a millionaire overnight if you wanted to plug some GE refrigerator. I'm not speaking of GE, but manufacturer would pay you any amount of money just to put their name on the side of a barn in a comic strip for that free advertising. But that's strictly taboo, and we have never abused it. But if it would come to the Red Cross or some national benefit or thing of national interest, then all of us would plug that.
The other point I'm making, I know that often media are often accused of maybe giving too much support to some of the problems that we have, to some of the whether correctly or not correctly, lending support to some of the various problems that we deal with today, particularly the maybe overplaying the hippies and this sort of thing.
Well, I would say that there's two ways of looking
I've
at
noted.
it. You have two different sides, we'll call it, in the newspaper. Let's say one's Democratic and one's Republican. But I never believed that in a comic strip any cause should be promoted one way or another, political or what, just like some of the actors now are taking political sides, which I don't think is quite right because they're taking advantage of their popularity any more than a comic strip artist. Now, there are comic strip, I call them queers, that try to sneak in their own personal interest. Well, that's taking advantage of their circulation to the public, and that I don't think that's fair. Now, my son happens to be sitting here at this moment, and he's with CBS. And CBS, NBC, and all those now are the public, or certain writers, or certain newspapers are accusing them, you've heard it right now weekly, of being biased on certain issues due to these riots and things like that. And he could tell you things right now that, that's not even in print, that they try to suppress, trying to subdue some of this riot, and like the explosion you heard the other day and all that stuff. But I don't think a thing like that, where it's pure entertainment, you should ever influence anything, because you take a 6-year-old kid, my God, you're a Santa Claus or a hero to him. And if you take advantage of that just for your own personal ego, I'm not in accord with it, and neither are most of the nationally known cartoonists. But there are a few of them that are sneakers that'll take advantage of that for their own personal, I call it just fun's all. Morbid.
You obviously, of course, like anybody, have personal philosophies. I wonder if you could give a little bit of your personal philosophy, and obviously anybody's philosophy in one way or another is reflected in whatever he does creatively. I wonder if you could tell us a little about this. This is a rather broad question about.
I don't quite understand it yet. I didn't know whether you were still talking about the influence on the generations, or the younger generation now, or what.
Well, for example, you say that Red Ryder, you'll never have Red Ryder smoking a cigarette, and that doesn't.
Well, I'd have every mama in the world after me.
Yes.
I've done a lot of things that are bad in a comic strip that I wasn't even aware of. One day I had a letter, an awful nice letter, from a man in Canada. And if I'd have been him, I'd have come down here and broken my neck. But during a sequence that I had written, they were going to hang Red Ryder. Well, in a Western story, that's a very common thing. I didn't show any hanging, but they did have a rope around his neck. So he wrote a nice letter and said he had a little 6-year-old boy, and by the grace of God, his mother got out there just in time. He had stood on an apple box and was just about to jump. Well, I never did that again. But, there's things that any little, I call it moronic, any moronic, but that younger, he wasn't even old enough to be a moron. But you can't police the world, but you try to keep those taboos. I couldn't even have a snake in my strip, because a lot of people faint at the sight of a picture of a snake in a strip. So you have taboos that you, over periods of many, many years, you have to learn. You don't sit down and read a bunch of rules and then start to draw.
Could you give any other examples of reactions that you may have had from readers that were either particularly interesting or?
Oh my, I could write books on it. I mean, some are good and some are bad. I've had kids run away from home from the east and wind up on my ranch, things like that. I've had crank letters that were absolutely dangerous, maniacs, grown-up men, and I would take that up with the local authorities by mail, like the Red Cross, to have that man investigated, and, well, he'd have to be locked up or he'd kill somebody. Things of that nature, I believe, is what you mean. And then you have just the opposite type. Thousands of letters come in, how nice things are, and other artists get the same thing. I'm no different. Mine was popular, I think, because cowboys are more or less our heritage in this country. But it's funny that you go to Japan, my stuff used to run over there, and they're cowboy and baseball crazy. And cowboys happen to be, and my friend sitting here, George Russell, cowboy all his life in pictures, 30 years, will tell you that in foreign countries, the cowboy movies are the first thing. American cowboy movies. Japan are even now making their own cowboy movies.
I've noticed, and you have more so, I'm sure, the transition of comic strips. I probably, as I know, would assume the first comic strips began as what you might call comic strips. In other words, the funny type. Then nearly all of them seemed to move into the story type, where they were carrying a running story, soap opera type story, and that became the popular type. And recently, you've seen the move back into satire, often with less emphasis on the art than on the satire itself. Would you discuss just a little bit more or less the transition of comic strips as you have seen them?
Well, I don't see too much of a transition, but the reason you have story type that came in, that was a long time ago, was naturally to hold reader interest, suspense until the next day. That's why in the early days of the movies you had your serial, and that theater was bound to have another ticket sold by the return next week. But there are two different types of cartoonists. I happened to be an illustrator before I was a comic artist. So mine was a continued story. Now you have some that are very sophisticated, like Pogo. That's very deep, in thought, and it's very, very good. But it's still, the drawing is highly a comic. Now you take Peanuts. That isn't a kid strip by any means. It's too deep. And it's one of the most popular strips out. But that has no continued story. Now Milk Caniff, Steve Canyon, that is very good, but that's a continued story to hold reader interest. But when you read a comic strip one day and you have the last of the punchline, if it's awfully good, you don't have to have a story to make that man, like Blondie instant. Chick Young has had that, and it's been a top strip and a large money maker now for going on 40-some years, or 30-some years now. So nothing really holds true. It depends on the actual individual, what his draftsmanship is. And like Peanuts, there's no draftsmanship to it. But it's his clever words and the philosophy that he's trying to deliver through those little cute characters.
You had obviously a very lucrative thing going and a very successful thing going with Red Ryder, and you dropped Red Ryder to go into what I would assume is probably a less lucrative field in serious Western. I may be incorrect, in serious Western painting. What prompted you to make this transition and to drop a successful comic strip to go into the other field?
Well, simply because I'm getting older and I always wanted to paint, and I always did paint. But not, it would be commercially, but you take a young artist without a name and married and children, commercial art pays much more. I went into comics purely for two reasons: the lucrative end, and also it was the only Western end I could get into. And it did make an awful lot of money. But because of that many years, the Fred Harmon name in all those papers all over the world, I had a built-up audience, and the door was open to me on my paintings. Now, that did not make a better painting, but it did give me a break. I wasn't a stranger to anyone, and right at this moment, my paintings are very lucrative because I happen to be one of the 2 or 3 highest paid Western artists in the United States. And some of these paintings you see right here now at the Cowboy Hall of Fame are, well, when you get up into the 10 figures, they're expensive paintings. So I would say it's lucrative to me, but there's many that it's not lucrative. You see poor lawyers and you see rich lawyers. By the way, I didn't say I was rich.
Did you, what kind of comments or what kind of reaction did you have from your audience when you dropped Red Ryder?
Oh, all kinds of, naturally. From the editorial on down to personal letters. One of the last come in, a very sweet thing. I don't know where it was. I think it was an editorial on the editorial page for the editor. I think that was from Hawaii. It says, "So long, Red Ryder." An awfully nice thing. I got a frame to save it. It was written so nice. So all types of reaction.
When you were drawing Red Ryder, you mentioned the mail that you got. What was the average volume of mail that you were receiving on that?
I don't recall. It could be 10 letters a day. It could be 150 letters a day. But it was just a steady stream. I usually had a printed postcard, Little Beaver and I on a horse, and autographed, and I'd just mail that out. If it was a letter, my wife would answer. Too many widows and women leaving home for cowboys. That's happened. My son will tell you that. One day he called me from New York, Paul. He said, "You better get back to the ranch quick." It's the other way. He was at the ranch and I was in New York on a trip. He said, "That woman's on her way here," but she was out of her mind. I can tell by a letter. You know, if a person writes a letter like that and sends me a picture of her, and she meticulously cuts out her husband's picture next to it instead of cropping it in two, and one letter is highly religious or the next letter highly sexy, then you turn that to local authorities. They won't do anything, but they will investigate.
You've had some experience in Oklahoma, been through here. I wonder if you might relate a little bit about experiences that you may have had in the state of Oklahoma and possibly personalities in the state with whom you have had contact and may have some comment.
Well, mine's been so many over years, but I can't. It's just hard to pick out one. But it's like the famous Butler brothers here at Elk City. You know, they furnish the livestock and put on the rodeos all over the country. I've ridden in so many of their rodeos all over the country, and I've been identified here with the Cowboy Hall of Fame since its beginning 5 years ago. And I know some of the famous ropers I attend here, SQ and that bunch, and a bunch of the old-time trick riders and ropers. And then I have many personal collectors, customers, so to speak, all over the state. But I've been through here, my goodness, since the 30s, you know, traveling and calling on newspapers and things like that during the Red Ryder days. And I don't know whether I've ever ridden any rodeos here in Oklahoma. I have around Texas, but I don't recall. But I date back here a long time ago, you know, in the early Dust Bowl. I was kind of a pitiful sight down in this country then and all over the Southwest. Remember, I used to see a man walking down the street. He had no home left, all covered with sand, carrying a baby, and about a half-mile back his wife would be walking, and back of that one family would be strung out for 3 miles. They didn't know where they were going. It was a pitiful sight.
Could you tell me what of the older Western painters are the ones that you have studied the most or have the most admiration for, or any comments you might make on them?
Well, there were so many, you know, the date way back prior to Charlie Russell, but I believe Charlie Russell would be my favorite. So many people say Remington, but Remington wasn't a cowboy artist. He was a New York man who followed the cavalry around. Very wonderful painter, and But what made he and Charlie Russell great, they were there at the time with no cameras, and it's recorded history. But between the two, my favorite cowboy artist would be Charlie Russell, because when he made a saddle, he knew what type of saddle he was putting on that horse. Been many great painters of the West, but they didn't have the cowboy flavor, and only a man who lived around it all his life. I got many artists who can now paint me, but a lot of them have to do it by research. I don't use research. If I don't know it, there's plenty I don't know, but what I don't know, I don't paint. I don't have time for research.
You mentioned a camera. Do you use a camera quite a bit?
Only to photograph and keep a record of my paintings. I don't photograph in order to copy of my photograph, but I have an Ektachrome. You see my new book right in front of you. Had I not saved those color Ektachromes, there would be no book. It'd be impossible to round up 100 paintings all over the United States and get them in one office back east for the engraver to make. So, because they're all sold, gone, known by different people all over the country. But I do not use, I travel a lot, but I know my country so well, the Southwest, that I'll drive through it and it'll refresh my mind on a certain subject, but I don't use anything to work by. I mean, I'll sit and doodle or make little comprehensive sketches till I get my composition right. Then when I see it in my mind, the color, I start whipping that canvas.
Are there any comments you might like to make on the Cowboy Hall of Fame?
I think it's going to be one of the greatest things in America. All 11 western states wanted the honor of having it in Oklahoma City. Montana, Colorado, where I live, did. California wanted it. Arizona wanted it. New Mexico wanted it. And the trustees here are from all over, you know, are representative, and they were very wealthy men who donated and helped start this. And they got Mr. Dean Crakel here as managing director. His history, he's an old Colorado man himself. Not old, he's a young man. And but he was with Gilcrease with a great knowledge of art, Western art particularly, and bronzes and Charlie Russell stuff. And this right now is with the 30 acres they have here, my goodness, and I'd like to see it in 50 years from now, how rapidly it's growing and what it's going to mean to the United States. But I do think, and I've told that a long time ago, I wish, you know, in Colorado where I live, in New Mexico, but I don't think they could have had it in a finer place, because you have more traffic here right on Highway 66. If you put it up in Montana, you do not have near the traffic you know, from the east as you would have right straight through on Highway 66, and it's a beautiful location. The country's beautiful.
You followed Rodeo, and you're from Colorado, I believe, where the National Rodeo headquarters is,
yes,
the RCA. Yeah. I wonder if you might comment a little on Rodeo as it was and as it is.
Well, the Rodeo RCA was formed. That was Everett Bowman. When was that, George? It was what year was that? That was in the 30s, about that time. It was that was the Turtles. But the Rodeo Cowboys of America, which is an organization of the cowboys for the betterment of their own riders. And the headquarters, that was Pinky Bolin, wasn't it? I think he just recently died, who was head of that. Yeah, I used to see him up there in the rodeo, the Denver Stock Show every year.
Any major differences in the old rodeo and the rodeo today?
Well, the old rodeo, in the old days, there's a lot of difference now, because you know, the rules, the timing, and the influence of the Humane Society. You know what I mean? You can't swat a fly anymore, and the man doesn't make any difference. He gets his neck broke, but don't let a fly sting a horse. With all due respect to him on other things.
What about the old cowboy rider and the new cowboy rider?
These new cowboy riders are just as good as the old cowboy riders. It all depends on the horse you're on, and There's some of these young riders that never worked on a ranch in their life that are awful good riders, but we don't call them cowboys, but they get out in the arena, and a lot of them will do a wonderful job, and a lot of them won't. A lot of them put them on a ranch, and they wouldn't know where they belong, but most of them are doggone good.
The National Finals Rodeo is being held here, has been for the past 4 years. Would you comment on the National Finals? Have you seen any of those events?
No, I haven't. I was down here when the Cowboy Hall of Fame here started the National Championship roping contest, which was during the same period. So I was busy over here, and I didn't go over, so I just don't know enough about it, but I used to know so many of the riders and everything, and naturally I think it's one of the greatest things in the country. You should be proud as hell here.
Could you tell us about your time you were in Hollywood?
Well, I told you a while ago when I went to Hollywood in the early 30s, 1933, I believe George Russell here is one of the first men I met and been a friend ever since. But during that period, I think all the greats of the old famous outlaws and everything else lived there at that time, and I had the privilege of knowing so many of them, like Emmett Dalton, Will James, and old Jim Jennings, the old train robber, and all things like that. In fact, they made me an honorary member of what was called the Chuck Wagon Trailers, which was an organization of those old horse thieves, cattlemen, jailbirds, and everything else who had, at that time, were one of the most respected men in the world, like Emmett Dalton. I was with him when he died, not with him, but the night before in bed, and we'd sit there and reminisce and talk, and I'd only known him a few weeks, but he was a grand gentleman, highly respected by everybody in the country, and you could have trusted him with anything in the world, even though in his younger days, when he was 21, well, if you'll recall history, he was put in prison, all his brothers, and were killed in that Coffeyville fight. Then I used to know old-timers there that had watched that fight and told me about it, which made it quite interesting. But Emmett Dalton was in for 17 years and was pardoned by McKinley, President McKinley. But his wife waited for him. She was an Indian girl. 17 years, and they were married. I knew her well. And then old Al Jennings, he still toted that pistol at 70, 80 years old, but everybody knew he was so harmless that George here knows he well. But Will James, the author and cowboy artist, used to come up to my studio there so often to shoot the breeze, and it was very interesting to meet these old timers, and they've been painted as such bad men, and my goodness, the little towns we lived in, like the common so-called low-down crook in this country, he couldn't live in a small town. They wouldn't allow it. There's plenty of them rode a fast pony in a long loop, but they didn't last long around.
Your son had just told us about an experience of someone who had visited. I'd like for you to recount that, if you would.
Well, it happened to do with there's been so many books and stories and lies and everything told and versions of the Custer massacre. Well, I know who was called. He's a very famous Indian. He's been in pictures with Buffalo Bill. He's still living, hale and hearty, way up in his 90s. If you'll recall, the massacre, I believe, was in 76. And this man, his name is Chief Redfox. He's been all over the world. He used to be a trick rider in the movies. He still wears that long hair. And he's in my house quite frequently. I'd say every year, a couple of years or so. And he's 96 now, living in Corpus Christi. But he was telling me the true story of that Custer fight. And he watched it when he was 8, 9 years old. And he is the nephew of Crazy Horse, who was the leader of the Indians in the Battle of Custer. And Custer, of course, went in there to kill a bunch of women and kids and thought there was only a few of them. And he made a pretty big mistake and had separated his bunch. Reno and everybody went in different directions. I'm not going to tell this whole story, but when Red Fox tells it, there's no animosity at all between the Anglo and the Indian when he's talking, but he just tells the truth, where Custer made his mistake. But on this one particular thing, he said the white man, when he won, it was a big victory, but when the Indian won, it was a massacre. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. In fact, he made a tape. I have that half-hour recording, but I'll never run it without his permission or put it in book form unless I had his permission or he was dead. But it's a half-hour right in my own home, the true story of that. And he's given talks on it all over the world. In fact, he was the first graduate of Carlisle University. Remember the Indian school when that was formed? He was the first graduate, and that's a long time ago.
You have your family with you here at the Cowboy Hall of Fame. I wonder if you'd tell us a little about your family.
Yes, I have three. One, the grandchild, and my son Fred. He's actually Fred the Third. I'm a junior, but I've never left at all. Not that I'm ashamed of junior, but I just signed my name as a professionally Fred Harmon. And then my grandchild Rick is the fourth, but we call him Ricks because there's just too many Freds. It gets our families, you can't have three people come and run at once. And he has a nice wife who used to be our next door neighbor in New York when we owned a home there for a while, Blanche. And my son here went into the Navy just a little before he would have been drafted so he could choose the occupation that he wanted. He liked electronics and electricity, so by joining early in the Second World War, he could choose what he wanted to follow, whether it's a dishwasher, cook, or anything else. So he was an electrician on the Kearsarge, and he was in about 18 months when the war was over. And when he got out of, when the war was over with Japan, he wanted to go to, I believe he did, I'm speaking what I think now, not his words, but MIT or Boulder, the School of Mines in Denver. But at that time, colleges were absolutely chock full and he couldn't enroll. So we went to a little small college in Colorado called Fort Lewis. And that must have been a lark. He didn't like the food, so he put up a tent and lived in that and did his own cooking with another boy. And then at night he'd go out and shoot deer and then drive 80, 90 miles to bring it up to my wife and I to hide it out so that they wouldn't find them. So I think that's a good way for a college kid to live. Well, anyway, he went back east. I maintained an office there through an agent, and I hope he doesn't go to jail for that, what I said. But anyway, he went through, graduated from RCA, Institute of Higher Technology, and that's when, CBS nabbed him as an engineer, and he's been with them around 15 years. And he was here last summer, and we spent up at the ranch a month, but he made this special trip over the weekend for this nice little honor of a one-man art show that the Cowboy Hall of Fame has shown right now.
You have a grandson here too, don't you?
Rick, excuse me. I have answered questions all day yesterday to thousands of people. In fact, I've been on the road for one solid month with this book on autograph parties. Now I'm billed at the Sahara Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada over Thanksgiving week. Then I hope I can start painting 1st of January. I'm in December.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fred Harmon.
He said the Indians went around and around, even the squaws, kicking up dust. So he said nobody could see anything. I meant the Custers then. And he said everybody's taking credit for, killing Custer. He said nobody knows who. He said his actual words were, he said the bullets and arrows were falling like rain. He said no one knows who or when Custer was killed. And when authorities come out and tell you that, he said they're just lying. They don't know. He said we Indians don't know. He said we have a lot of Indians that claim they killed Custer, but he said no one knows who did. He said there was too much. It's too quick. It's over in a few minutes.
Those last comments were made by Mr. Harmon from conversation with Chief Redfox.